Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Tonight we have Annette Smith with us, who is the Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, and my co-host Ben Kinsley is here with us. Both of our guests are remotely. Not that you're a guest, Ben. You're one of the gang. But anyway, we're really pleased to have Annette here because we're going to be talking about S5, which I'm assuming a lot of you already know about. It's the Clean Heat Standard Bill, and it is creating quite a stir. Annette, could you share a little about your background and about Vermonters for a Clean Environment for our viewers?
Sure. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, which was founded in 1999 to deal with a billion-dollar natural gas power plant and pipeline project. I live in Danby. I was a small farmer growing my own food, getting into biodynamic farming, making products to sell. Never expected to be doing this 23 years later. Well, in the last 23 years, we've worked all over Vermont and assist communities in having a voice in what goes on. We've worked on landfills, large farms, quarries, gravel pits, wind and solar, and gotten back to energy again. So it's been an interesting journey. I'm originally from central Pennsylvania, where I would be, I don't know, seventh or eighth generation if my parents had stayed put, but they moved our family to Sarasota, Florida when I was 7 years old. And I got to see the power of the bulldozer, and what happened in 10 years was really astonishing. And so that's one of the things that motivates my work to protect Vermont in many ways.
Well, we're very glad you are where you are. So, Ben, you want to take it away?
Sure. So there's Pat kind of buried the lead here a little bit, but there's several issues we know that you've engaged on. The most recent one being S5, which is the carbon reduction bill addressing the thermal sector. It was voted out of the Senate today, but you've been very vocal about this bill, as have many Vermonters. I really am struggling to remember, a bill or a piece of legislation that's gotten this much of a reaction from people, quite honestly. And I've worked in the State House for over a decade now, and I'm struggling to remember something that had this visceral of a reaction from folks. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what your stance is on the legislation, and what your strategies have been in terms of advocating around it.
So this bill, appeared last year. It was called the Clean Heat Standard. This year it was renamed the Affordable Heat Act, but it originated through the Climate Council. And so that's how I got involved, because after the Climate Council was formed, I began monitoring their meetings. So I monitored the full council meetings, the steering committee meetings. There are 5 subcommittees, and I took the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, occasionally weighed in with just transitions and science and data, and spent a lot of time also in ag and ecosystems. I was one of, I would say, 3 or 4 citizens who I logged a lot of hours. I'm probably at the top of the list of people who have monitored this. And so I saw what was happening. And what happened was very different from what's being pitched now, that, oh, this is a recommendation of the Climate Council. Well, okay, it's an idea of Rich Cowart and Chris Nemi. Rich Cowart runs the Regulatory Assistance Project, and previously he was chair of the Public Service Board. He was pushing for Vermont to deregulate the electric utilities back in the 90s. And that was a big push back in the 90s by Governor Dean and by Rich Cowart. All the surrounding states did deregulate. There was an article in the New York Times just in January about the states that have deregulated all have higher electricity prices. So my point is that Rich Cowart can promote ideas that are not necessarily good ideas, and that he is the architect of this bill is, I think, a similar piece of bad public policy. So what really happened was that this was pretty much presented to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, which is very much as the Climate Council is, a rah-rah cheerleader group, except for the administration appointees who are in the minority. And so they voted it out of their committee. And then watching how the full climate action plan came together was just unbelievable. They did not have enough time. They were told in advance by Maine and New York and Massachusetts, nobody's done it in a year. And so literally nobody had seen the final plan the night before it was released, and they had to vote on it the next day to meet the deadlines. And so I'm sure that, I know because I was watching the meetings, that the whole concept of that this was a group decision that everyone agreed on. I'm sure that most of the counselors who weren't on cross-sector mitigation didn't even really know what this was about. And I think that's still true of the legislators who are voting for it, that they don't understand what it is. I call it, you call it a carbon reduction bill. I call it a carbon credit bill, because that's really what it's about. It's about credits. And that adds to the complexity of what it's doing.
Well, I like that they now renamed it affordable. Maybe not. And you sent out a commentary, and I'm so impressed with this commentary. I'm going to read a little bit of it because you did not mince words. You are very proud of you. You started off with the following quote: "Someone has to say it. Vermont's legislature has been taken over by a religious cult," and it goes on from there. And I was like, good, Annette. Could you summarize your thoughts as you reflected in that commentary about the fuel dealers' attack on moderate and low-income Vermonters, and may I say those of us on fixed income, just being personal here?
And that commentary, which is posted on Vermont Digger, is especially valuable because of the map.
Yes.
And so when I first saw who the climate counselors were, I mapped them. And they're all within what some refer to as the Burlington to Montpelier bubble. They are almost all within I-89. There are two down in southeastern Vermont near I-91. But all the rural areas are not represented at all. And then fairly recently, Efficiency Vermont presented their heat burden map. And so I overlaid that onto Google Earth with all of the locations of the climate counselors. And only two people on the council, and they both work for the administration, are in towns that have high energy burdens. There are no counselors on the highest energy burden towns. And it just shows how a group, really an elite group, has made this decision to move forward this recommendation to the legislature with actually, this is not a carrot approach, incentive approach. This is a stick approach that throughout the whole process, Jared Duval, who I refer to in the commentary as King Jared, because he's always there saying we're not going to meet our emissions reduction goals or mandates unless we pass this and this. So the Transportation Compact, TCI, and some sort of a heat standard, he says will enable us to meet the mandates, and then the state won't get sued. And of course, being sued was put into the law by the legislature, and they could remove it. So the history of it is how unbalanced it is. And then the thing that really got me to write that commentary the way that I did which was really gloves off, was when Jared Duval came in and attacked A&R Secretary Moore's calculations. And she admitted this is back of the envelope. It may be wrong. It is wrong. I don't know in which way it's wrong. And they came in and basically, Jared Duval came in and basically called her a liar.
Wow.
And, the words are in the commentary. I quoted exactly what he said in his testimony: misleading. And the fundamental issue that she was trying to make, and that is extremely valid. And I listened to the floor debate today, and it really wasn't made. The point wasn't made that the idea is that through creating a value for a credit, those credits will then be earned by the installation of, say, a heat pump or weatherization of the home. So let's just use those two examples. Darren Springer of Burlington Electric Department came in and testified that they have this great subsidy program for heat pumps, $5,000, and they're paying 75% of it. Okay, that leaves $1,250. That's a lot of money. I don't have that. I work paycheck to paycheck. I don't have it sitting around. Weatherization. The last meeting of the cross-sector mitigation of the Climate Council a week or two ago had a lot of presentations about weatherization. You're talking pretty much minimum $10,000. Now, there is a pilot program that pays the full costs for a few hundred homes, but that's not what this bill is about. This bill is, oh, well, we're going to address low and moderate income people, and 50% of these credits have to benefit them. But it doesn't provide the upfront money, no matter where or how many subsidies you have, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's something the utility is doing, whether it's something that is done by the PUC in this process. You still have these massive upfront costs that supposedly will enable it. And then there are a couple of other pieces in this bill that are really quite offensive, that are not getting much play. More than 50% of the credits are basically going to be earned by using biofuels from Kansas and Nebraska, where Chris Bray says, oh, we can do those locally. No, we're not going to be producing all our biofuels in Vermont. That's absurd. And the land conversion and all the issues with biofuels are massive. And then renewable natural gas, where's that coming from? Oh, Vermont Gas Systems is getting a contract from a landfill in New York, by the way, a stinky landfill that has had a lot of lawsuits over it. And by putting a few molecules of that into the pipeline and claiming that some of those will get to Vermont, they're going to be able to earn credits from that. And so it begins to sort of sound like a bit of a scam. I mean, it's just, how do you track all this? Who's going to track it all? And there's more, but that's just the beginning of the complexity of it.
Yeah, something that Oregon did with their fuels bill, they did this for transportation motor fuels, which is easier because you have some more similar technologies, right, with motor fuels. And they'd implemented it. They did 10 years just to figure out how to implement it. And it was a much more limited scale. They're talking like, right now it's, a few pennies per gallon of diesel, non-biodiesel, but just regular highway grade diesel, or gasoline, and a couple pennies, and then it's offsetting costs for things like biodiesel, where you could save like 30 cents a gallon on biodiesel because of the way that the incentive structure works. And so they started out much more limited, much more focused, with a clearer mission than this bill is offering. And this is a very complex system that they're proposing to do in 2 years, 3 years to design it and, come back.
Year and a half, really.
Year and a half. Just it doesn't seem like it's very realistic. I'd like to read a section from the purpose statement of the bill, which is to say that the subject is climate change, air pollution, renewable energy, heating fuel, and the purpose is to establish a clean heat standard to reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions from the thermal sector. The clean heat standard shall be administered by the Public Utility Commission with the assistance of the Clean Heat Standard Technical Advisory Group and the Equity Advisory Group. One of the concerns here is the Public Utility Commission basically is being asked to design this thing. We have no idea what it's going to cost until they design it and come back. And one last minute change that was made right before the bill was voted on in the floor was to add a checkback provision, because at first they were just going to pass this thing, let the Public Utility Commission implement it, and see where they landed. They did add an amendment last minute that requires that, this coming back for a vote, which is a positive development, but it's still very concerning that we're passing this massive spending bill with no understanding of what it's going to cost, right? And who's going to be paying for it.
And if you're paying attention to the Climate Council, you know that the Agency of Natural Resources has issued an RFP for a life cycle analysis. The Climate Council has a Just Transition subcommittee focused on equity, and they have a Science and Data committee focused on technical things. All of those things are now being repeated in this clean heat standard, where they're telling the PUC to do a life cycle analysis. They're telling them to create a technical advisory committee, and they're telling them to create an equity group. And I can tell you from watching the Climate Council meetings, like these committees are extremely dysfunctional. They have not been given guidance on how to run them. And so I have no idea how it's going to go at the PUC. And then the budget for the Department of Public Service and the PUC together is about $1.7 million just to implement this. This is on top of the money for the Climate Council, on top of what we now have as the Office for Climate. And I mean, we're talking millions and millions of dollars on top of the more than $200 million that the administration and the legislature has put into climate initiatives since this came up last year. And so we're already doing a lot of the things that this bill is supposedly intended to create incentives for, with the idea that we have to do this or it will reduce, and we will get sued because we haven't reduced our emissions, with no real evidence that this will reduce emissions. Wow. I mean, the idea of heat pumps, I keep hearing from people who say, well, they work great for air conditioning, but I can't use them in the coldest part of winter. Now, there obviously are different technologies of heat pumps, and some people say they don't work down to 20 degrees. They don't work down to 0 or minus 20. But I think that the newer ones do work in colder weather. But apparently what happens is that you get really hit with your electric bill. Right. And so this is essentially taking the money from the fuel sector and giving the money to the electric utilities, with no guarantee that prices are going to stay where they are, claiming you're going to save money, but who knows what's going to happen to electric rates? Do you think they might go up?
Yeah, it's scary. They've formed, or are supposed to form, an equity advisory group. And Suksana Davis, who's the director of racial equity for the state, she thinks this bill is going to make it worse. I mean, she was very vocal, which surprised me, about that this bill has got an issue with equity, and she's got a real problem with the bill. And I think Senator Bray said, well, just pass the bill and we'll fix it later on. And you know how that works in this place. And I think she's smarter.
And she made a really good point. She gave excellent testimony that equity always seems to be the last thing that, here I am testifying the last day that you're voting this bill out of committee. And Senator Bray said, yes, it's bad on me. I should have come to you earlier. And that's the way it goes.
Right.
And it's so discouraging to see what's happened when I get back to that statement that I called the legislature's been taken over by a religious cult. I didn't want to write that commentary. That's not what I want to work with people. But what we're seeing really is that, VPIRG and this group that's electing women legislators, it's almost like it's an indoctrination process.
Right.
That the people who get in, do they lose their ability to think independently? And when you heard the testimony that the Senate committee took this year, all I could think of was, thank goodness this didn't pass last year, because there are so many holes in it that were identified. And it's only going to get worse.
I'm assuming the governor is going to veto this again, I would assume at this point, because I don't think much has changed since last year. I think the people that work for him have been pretty vocal. I mean, Suksana is what reports directly into the governor, I believe, and she just said this isn't working. We've got all the right words, but we don't put it in action.
if anything, we've all gotten more clarity on just how bad it is and
Yeah.
how much there is
Interesting.
wrong with
Yeah.
it.
Well,
Yeah,
you,
I
It's
think
also it's because of my work that has really so much been involved with assisting citizens and participating at the Public Utility Commission over the last few years, I've come to realize and recognize that we have a Public Utility Commission that is the only PUC in the country that does solar siting and that does telecom tower siting. Everywhere else, it's done by local zoning. And so we already have a PUC that is, I think, overburdened already. And now we're going to throw this
right,
at them?
right.
I think it's really disrespectful. And I will also say the Department of Public Service is equally stressed just to try and keep up with all the work they're trying to do. They have been required, the department and the state agencies have been required to participate in the Climate Council without giving them money for it. It's taken huge amounts of time, I mean, massive amounts of time from state agency people who need to be doing their work. And so I view this as a distraction. And when I testified on this bill, that's where I started. There are so many issues you should be dealing with. And this is not a top priority. It's not going to do what you think it is.
no.
And you're taking away from the work that really needs to be done on energy policy.
Yeah, and I know the municipalities are very unhappy because, as you just mentioned, they're taking authority away from the zoning people in our municipalities and doing it on the state level, and they're not happy. They're
That
pretty
bill's
upset.
in that committee too now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you made a point about how the criticism of this bill has sharpened. I think this time around versus the last time this bill was introduced, and I think it's partially because there's been more scrutiny of it this time around, and more holes are emerging. Right? I think that's my perception is that as experts are really looking at this thing. I mean, what's really telling to me, right? If you look at the people that are almost certainly stand to gain from this bill, right? And you talked about some of them. It's the electric utilities. They're going to be able to sell more electricity. It's the solar and wind industry because the electric utilities are going to be required to buy more and more energy from those providers. And it's going to be the installers of heat pumps, right?
And actually, Vermont Gas Systems is
Vermont Gas, yeah,
they are heavily invested in this.
Yeah.
And then look at Rich Cowart from the Regulatory Assistance Project. We found out that his Regulatory Assistance Project got a contract to sell this to Massachusetts for $200,000.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real conflict of interest for him to be on the Climate Council and actually making money on this. I find that to be, I mean, I know there are a lot of conflicts of interest in Vermont, but that one crosses a line in my mind. And I've called him out on it at the Climate Council.
Good for you.
It didn't go anywhere, but I've been telling it like it is all along.
Yeah,
And it doesn't make any
I'm going to make sure that map gets put on this video so that people can see it, because you made a very good point. That map was right on. And it just shows where everybody's coming from and that they're not looking at rural Vermont at all.
No, and I live in rural Vermont, and I also live off grid with solar, and I have for more than 30 years. And so from my own personal perspective, what I can tell you is that all this bill is going to do is increase my propane costs, because I've got solar hot water, I've got photovoltaics and batteries and a backup gasoline generator. And I was required by my fire insurance company to put in a furnace. So I put in a non-electric propane furnace. I have a propane hot water heater and propane refrigerator. I don't have an alternative to propane. And there's nothing in this bill that I can use. I can't get a pellet stove. I use a regular, well, it's a soapstone stove with a catalytic converter, but a pellet stove has a fan that runs all the time. Sorry, non-starter. That would run down my batteries at night. Heat pump, forget it. Way too much electricity draw, and couldn't run it at night. So what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to swap out my propane furnace for a biofuel furnace? Is that my only opportunity to help my fuel dealer stay in business? Except my fuel dealer doesn't sell oil. They only sell propane. Right. So my testimony was take propane out of it. And also, I'm going to get charged more for propane, even though I'm not using it entirely for heating. My refrigerator isn't for heating.
Wow.
And that's an example in my own situation, but that's true for a lot of people. There are other uses. People use propane for their backup generators.
Mhm.
So we don't have separate meters for that.
Forklift operators, like forklifts run on propane most of the time.
And
Oh,
farmers, they use diesel for all kinds of things. They'll do one buy, but then they have multiple uses. Not all of it is for thermal. So these are the sorts of things that are going to, I think, gum it all up at the Public Utility Commission. And I don't think the legislators understand that the Public Utility Commission will take these issues seriously. And they will come back having sliced and diced this to say, this is not possible to do what you want us to do.
have they talked about an enforcement component here in this bill? I don't
Oh, yeah.
remember. Have they? Because the public.
Not only that, they just wanted to increase the penalties from
Oh.
3 times to 4 times. Oh, yeah, this is very punitive.
Great.
And so it requires registration. It's not clear who the obligated parties are. It's anyone who takes delivery of fuel in Vermont. That for a while they were trying to claim it was just the big wholesalers, but no, it ropes in a lot of them, but it's really murky. And then there's this default delivery agent. What's the default delivery agent? Well, the PUC came in and said, we want more than one default delivery agent. So now there's default delivery agents. And so now imagine that you are a fuel dealer and you have to somehow acquire credits. Well, you can acquire those credits from anybody who installs a heat pump. Now, don't you think this is going to create quite the coercion going on? I mean, apparently there's all levels of, even if you can get someone to install, there are all levels of how well it's done. You get somebody to install a heat pump, they may be gone the next day. And then they have leverage over the fuel dealer to sell them the credit. I mean, who's going to track all this stuff?
Yeah,
That's the people they don't want to track it.
I didn't hear anybody talking about that, but just sitting listening, obviously somebody is going to be enforcing it. I had Matt Coda on a radio show I do. He's in charge of the fuel dealers in Vermont, and I have never seen him so revved up. I mean, usually he's pretty laid back and very, very quiet and talks, but not this time. He was just berserk because they're all don't know what to do. This is serious for the fuel dealers.
It's very serious, and there are some fuel dealers that are in favor of it, and they're the big ones. So what would happen, for instance, my propane comes from Haskins Gas in Dorset, and they are in an area that has, if you look at Green Mountain Power's grid, it's all in red in this area. And so people aren't just going to be able to add all kinds of things electric to their homes. So Haskins is starting out in a bad place. And since they can't help anybody convert, they got to buy, they have to keep truck drivers and keep those of us with appliances with service. It's a family business. They'll go out of business.
Right.
Yeah. And where we get stuck with the big companies who charge a lot more and are not fun to deal with and don't look out for the local people the way that I personally can say Haskins Gas has.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the key pieces there, the big fuel dealers in large part are the ones that are somewhat supportive of this, or at least open to the idea. And there's a couple things going on there. One, they tend to be installers of heat pump units, so this actually is a revenue driver for them in short term, because they'll get to install more of these units, and they also are typically delivering. They have more capacity to deliver biofuels, which also will help in the short and medium term, in terms of driving revenue for some of the bigger dealers, where some of the smaller ones can't buy wholesale biofuels at the price that the bigger outfits can. So it is going to lead to monopolies, and we're going to see that with the power utilities too, and that's also kind of a concerning thing. For putting all of our energy needs in one basket, ultimately over the next 30 to 50 years, we're going to have electric heat, we're going to have electric cars, we're going to have electric, appliances. What happens when the electricity goes out? We got a problem.
Right.
And we experienced recently, sometimes four or 5 days at a time in my area, and our our homes aren't built. We have to upgrade our electricity panels and circuitry, and then the grid itself is not ready for all of this. And so this idea that we're all going to electrify, I think it's crazy.
Yeah.
I would never. I've testified. You can't. You're putting all the eggs in one basket. The power goes out. I mean, my power doesn't go out because I'm not connected to the grid. But I hear it when it does around here. People say, "Oh, did your power go out?" And we didn't have anything for 5 days. And the whole idea that we're going to drive electric cars and charge them at home and have electric heat pumps, that all requires upgrading to 220 service.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Annette,
That by itself is.
I'm sorry. Do you think they're listening? I mean, you're a highly respected woman. You've certainly proved your knowledge over the years. Are they listening? I honestly don't think they are, and that's a bad thing.
And I did something when I testified on the bill that I knew was crossing the line, and I did it intentionally because I wanted to get their attention. And what I heard today in the floor debate reinforced why I did it. When I went in, I said, if you're going to play games about the name and change it from the Clean Heat Standard to the Affordable Heat Act, I have my own name for it, the Stupid Heat Standard.
Good for
And
you.
Senator White actually got up out of the room and slammed the door when I said that. But the reason I did it, and I apologized afterwards and said, I know I crossed a line, but I want to make the point. There's no fixing this.
No.
This is bad public policy.
Mm-hmm.
This is not something that you can say we're going to send it to the PUC and see what comes back and think anything good's going to come of that. It's going to be just as I have wasted, I will say, an enormous amount of time monitoring the Climate Council. Now I'm going to have to spend all that time monitoring what goes on with the PUC. We're piling layer on layer on layer of expensive and time-consuming process to do something that in the end is not going to achieve the goals. Whereas what's changed since this whole idea came up? The price of fossil fuels have gone up. So what was the goal here? Raise the price? Okay, that's happening. People already have the incentive. Oh, we want people to install heat pumps. People are trying to do that. They can't get anybody to install them.
It costs twice as much to install as a fossil fuel heat pump or a fossil fuel furnace.
Was it Richie Westman? I'm sorry, who said he's waiting months for somebody? He put that in the paper in Digger, and he said he's got one in his garage, and he's waiting for somebody to install it.
Got some sort of very good heating system that cost $22,000. He's been waiting 21 months and he can't get anybody to install it. This is a standard story all around. And same thing with weatherization. You're talking 7 months to a year for most of these things. There's supply chain issues. Even, that's for the people who have the thousands of dollars up front to do it. And so you think that the poor people are going to get a priority with the installers.
Right.
And, some of us have pretty crummy houses. I mean, I will say I do. I live in what was built as a hunting camp. It's not an easy matter to go in and weatherize, a mobile home or something. And so it's just, you ask Pat, are they listening? And that's what I think is sort of the heart of where we are right now. I do believe these are fine, caring people who want to do the right thing. But it seems like they've been taken over by something that says, but we're going to do something about climate change. And as long as you put that tag on it, we have to do it. We've heard Senator McDonald say it. We've heard Senator McCormick say it over and over. We can't wait any longer. We have to do it. And the other thing that's changed is the state got all this money and is putting something like $250 million into climate initiatives.
Wow.
And I'm saying, we're doing all this. Why do we need to torture the fuel dealers who are struggling to stay in business right now anyway, for the most part?
I think one of the most telling things for me in looking at this issue is, so the Agency of Natural Resources does a report every couple of years on energy in Vermont. And the last one was from 2022. And they listed actually in their report Here are the initiatives that get the most bang for our buck as a state in terms of carbon reduction. And they did it in kind of a cool way. So they said, here's like, and they cast it in what is this in savings to Vermonters as in terms of dollars spent and carbon reduction. And so basically, if you looked at it like, installing a heat pump, subsidies for installing a heat pump, it's like X number of state dollars and then savings to the person. And it was like, $5 per metric ton of carbon is what like the heat pumps were. But that's just the operating cost. That's not the cost of installation, right? You factor that in, it's going to be a little higher.
With maintenance, don't forget the maintenance.
And the maintenance. And then you look at things like weatherization, and that was actually like negative $10. There's $10 of savings for the homeowner for every metric ton of carbon that you took out of the atmosphere. And so, that obviously is a better return on investment if you can generate savings for somebody and also reduce carbon. And then electric vehicle subsidies, negative $100. So $100 in savings per every metric ton of carbon that you're removing. And then you start going up the scale. You got your heat pumps and the water heater pumps are better than the air heating pumps. Okay, so there's like a couple dollars difference there. And then you get to the end, and like the worst performing ones were the subsidies for solar panel installations. Those are like the net metering ones, $10,000 per metric ton of carbon, like that it's costing people. So it's like, let's look at what are our most effective ways of, managing costs, but also reducing carbon. It's electric vehicles by far. And then, a distant second is weatherization. And even looking at electric vehicles, any estimate that you look at, like, we're going to see a massive sea change over the next decade in the transportation sector.
Can I ask you, oh, I'm sorry, Ben. Annette would know this. I keep saying, if we did all of this, and we're the best of the best, we wouldn't move the needle an inch because we're so tiny. I mean, what can we, and I'm not disagreeing that we should do something. I think Ben and I both feel that there's things we should be doing, but to put all of us in jeopardy financially and everything else, the needle won't move because of what Vermont does. We're just too small, aren't we?
Yes. I mean, but we have to lead the way.
We have to be the best. Right.
And I guess I've gotten to the point, which I think a lot of Vermonters share. I never thought I was like a libertarian, but I really have gotten kind of, I mean, I'm really not partisan, but I've gotten kind of offended at this idea of the government telling me how I have to live. What happened to freedom and personal choice? And this goes well beyond the energy situation.
Yep.
But I want to be able to make my own choices and not be forced into giving up my propane stove and getting an electric cooktop when I can't afford it. That's just sort of, I don't know, it's this virtue signaling that we are going to be the leaders and make a difference. And, so I did want to, I think, address in one aspect of the financials that we should talk about, and that is that Jared Duval, who I call King Jared because he's always like, he's in the State House claiming he's representing the Climate Council, even though he was never appointed to do so, and he has not registered as a lobbyist. So he is lobbying as far as I'm concerned. I'm a registered lobbyist. I go in and testify, but he doesn't register. But King Jared has said, look, there's going to be a net savings of, by a certain date, $2 billion. And then now Senator Bray is saying, oh, over the life of up until 2050, there's going to be a net savings of $6 billion. And that's where A&R Secretary Moore came in and said, yes, but what's it cost up front? to get those savings. And so that's sort of the disconnect in the whole discussion financially, is that those who are touting the net savings don't want to look at where the money comes from the upfront costs. And Senator Bray did say in committee within the last 2 weeks, I think it was when Susanna Davis was testifying, that I've grappled with it. We haven't come up with a solution for the upfront costs.
Now
and even those long-term savings are pretty speculative, because that's based on the Paris Climate Accord target of 1.5 degrees, holding global climate change, global warming numbers to 1.5 degrees. So saying that Vermont is going to spend 1.7 billion and recognize savings of 6.4 billion is really not sound reasoning, because there's really no scientific evidence that suggests Vermont's reduction in carbon, which Vermont is already net zero, net neutral. But Vermont's reduction of carbon to make it more of a carbon sink is going to impact global emissions. That analysis has not been done.
And even if it is, it's all just modeling. Who knows? I mean, I've said over and over, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. And so all of this is very frustrating. When I have weighed in, which I have repeatedly at the Climate Council, I have said, please be realistic. Just that's been my sort of my mantra there, is everything you're doing is talking about buying more stuff. That's not where we need to be right now. We should be reducing consumption. We should be figuring out how to deal with all the stuff that we have now, this filling up our landfills. We have a lot of issues that all of this is a distraction from. And many people have pointed out, well, we could reduce our emissions to zero and it wouldn't make any difference in the global scheme of things. But I don't want to minimize that we have, a moral imperative to reduce emissions. I live at a very low emission life. But a lot of the people who are out preaching to us that we have to go and change the way we live are the ones that are flying all over the world, burning up the atmosphere, not staying home, they have some of the highest carbon footprints. So it's a very hypocritical topic. And at one point I had buttons made that says, what's your carbon footprint? Because I live a low carbon footprint life, and I'm offended. I walk the walk. And I'm offended by people who are telling me how I should live, and to everybody else how they should live, when they're not doing it themselves.
Yeah, and I think the hypocrisy there is definitely. I mean, you walk through the parking lot at the State House. I did this a couple weeks ago. You want to know how many electric vehicles were in the parking lot?
Zip.
10.
3 of them, and one of them was the governor's. There you go.
So Annette, before we got on air tonight, I had mentioned that Ben and I had drafted this letter, which I signed and sent to the senators, saying that you really shouldn't be voting on this bill unless you know the cost, because that's what it says, I think, in the Constitution, and that's always been the practice. And you sort of alluded to the fact they've got an answer to that and a way around that. What is?
Senator Gray got on the floor and said, "We've listened to you. We've listened to the people, and we've changed this so that we've put in it so that this is going to have this is going to come back to us. This is kind of going to be a study, and it's going to come back to us. And then the next legislature will get to decide whether or not to move it forward. And we'll have a full process, and the governor can weigh in." And then Senator Brock on the floor said he saw an Addison Independent article, and in which Senator Bray said this has essentially been turned into a study, but that's not quite what Senator Bray said on the floor. And so Senator Brock kind of caught him saying, is this just a study? Well, no, it's not a study. A number of the questions to Senator Bray today were about, well, are you locking the Public Utility Commission into this particular formula, or are there other things they can do?
Right.
No, they're locked in. I mean, they're stuck with this design that is really, the more you get into it with the details of the renewable natural gas and the biofuels and all the ways that installers can earn credits and the default delivery agent and the obligated parties, that there's so much unresolved. And as listening to the testimony, there were a lot of things the committee said, well, we'll come back to it. And they never came back to it.
Never came back to it, yeah.
So it's now being spun as a study Sort of.
But
Sort of.
you know,
We're gonna ask the Public Utility Commission to design it, and
Study it.
and then see if we like it or not. Right?
Yeah.
It's kind
Now,
of what-
there's something else that has occurred to me, and that is that this, as many of the legislators have said, and Ben, you said it, and apparently it was at the end of a WCAX news story last night, that this has gotten people's attention more than just about
Right.
anything in recent times. This has the potential to reinvigorate the Republican Party. It has the potential to be a real factor in the next election. And while as I said, I am nonpartisan, and I like having a democracy where we have two functioning parties that's how we get our best decisions, and we don't have that right now with the supermajority.
Well, and I would just add to that. I mean, I think the Progressive Party has more weight right now than the Republican Party does. Like in Vermont anyway, they're so dysfunctional even on their own. They can't even stand on their own 2 feet, let alone try to push back against anything that the supermajority does.
Well,
or it could ignite more independent-minded Democrats like Senator Irene Renner, who, I mean, that would be, I think, the best thing is for the Democratic Party to also have more diversity, so they're not all marching in lockstep.
And I think it's important that people need to know that on this committee, Bray's committee, there is only Democrats. They don't have any Republicans. I don't even think is there a progressive on there? I don't think so.
No,
it's all
yes
Democrats.
men.
Yeah.
No, it's two women and 3 men, and they're all true believers in yes men.
Right.
Some of those yes men, even though had serious questions about the bill, they ended up voting for it anyway. But Senator McCormick called it. He was quoted as calling it a Rube Goldberg machine, and he didn't have any idea how it actually worked.
And then Senator Bray tried to explain it, and that was a riot. Seeing him he couldn't explain it.
Yeah,
I mean,
no one can explain it in an intelligent way. Because
I can't. I mean, I can tell you the elements, but I couldn't explain how it's going to work or what it's. And then it gets into this life cycle analysis the PUC is supposed to get done, and it's all based on all this, as you point out, speculative modeling. I'm sad for our state that we're having to spend the time that we're having to spend on this ridiculousness when there are so many important things that we really should be working on.
Well,
even on a climate perspective, and I consider myself an environmentalist, I absolutely think we need to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to be good stewards of our environment. But there's so many other ways that we're falling short on that.
Yeah.
Our energy policies are very much in need of updating. I am very tired of fighting over solar siting and wind turbines. I want us to find ways to work together. People want to do this in the right way. And I presented a half a dozen documents to the committee with my testimony saying, these are the things we ought to be talking about. And you're not talking about these things.
Yeah, there's very little. I mean, yes, we need to do our part to reduce carbon emissions. What we really should be doing is doing everything we can to get our national, our country to move that direction. We have way more leverage as a country than we do as a state.
Ben, you and Asher put together a very strong document, and you had at the end of it several really seriously good ideas of how to address this issue without doing what we're doing now. Has anybody even talked about any of those issues? It just sounds like they've got this plan and that's it.
They already have the plan that they want, and
it's using up all the oxygen.
They're already bought and paid for by the lobbyists that are pushing this agenda.
Let's talk about the lobbyists for a minute. Now, there is this tenor that we heard on the Senate floor today. Oh, people are just being misled, and fear-mongering is going on with the fuel dealers who are running ads. Well, I saw somewhere that a Democrat was outraged that the fuel dealers had spent $35,000 or so on advertising. Well, I took a look at the lobbying for that Conservation Law Foundation, VPIRG, and Vermont Natural Resources Council has reported for the month of January, they have each reported over $10,000. So the three environmental groups have reported spending more than $30,000 just in
Wow.
the month of January.
Whoa.
I mean, yeah. And they've actually spent more than Vermont Gas Systems and GMP, who together I think it's been another 12,000. So the amount of money that the green groups, I mean, they may be doing lobbying on other issues, but still, that's a very large number for 1 month. And to vilify the fuel dealers for defending the small businesses, I think is I find that offensive, and it also calls into question the intelligence of Vermonters. And I have learned through my work, never underestimate the intelligence of Vermonters.
Right.
And Randy Brock said that in his closing line today on the Senate floor, is that I think that Vermonters are smarter than that.
Yeah,
and
I think so too. I think Vermonters will see through this. And you know, to go back to it, like you know, all the other things we could be doing. There's a bunch of things we can be doing from a carbon reduction standpoint that doesn't involve putting a price on carbon. It doesn't involve a carbon pricing scheme, especially in the thermal sector where the technology is just not there. Like, you know, we have good alternatives in the transportation sector. Like we're seeing that now. That technology has matured over the past 2 decades.
It's still all evolving too. And it's going to go down in cost. It's going to get better.
Right.
It's already the upfront cost is already dropping. It will be price competitive from an upfront cost with gasoline vehicles very shortly. The reliability is improving dramatically. Already, you know, we've known for a long time that the cost of operating is much lower than a gasoline vehicle, and we're also, you know, seeing more and more charging options that make them more practical, right?
Well, I do have to say, having worked on mining issues, that I have a real problem with the massive resource extraction necessary globally to fuel this electrification of everything. Yeah. And it's a big problem. The mining is going on and being proposed in areas that especially affect indigenous populations and more remote areas, and it can't be ignored. So I have to.
And I would say lithium mining is pretty detrimental to the environment. One of the good things about lithium is it is recyclable. Like you can recycle and remanufacture lithium battery packs.
Well, so on the Climate Council, there's this Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which got really frustrated because their mandate, the emissions reduction mandate, didn't touch them. And at one point, one of the co-chairs said, you know, we have no power. And honestly, it was true. The Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee has all the power. And when Ag and Ecosystems brought their recommendations to the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, they were treated it pretty badly, actually. And then the best counselor, who's no longer on, Chris Campany from the Wyndham Regional Commission, several times said, we could reduce our emissions to zero, and it's not going to help with all the flooding that we're having in southern Vermont.
Right. It's our resiliency, or it does
resiliency. And he several times said that the Climate Council needs to go to the legislature and expand what we're doing so that it's not just emissions reductions. And when I say that the Climate Council is dysfunctional, there really is no leader or no format for anyone to move an idea like that forward.
Wow.
It's just stunning to watch how...
Isn't this the bill that will allow Vermonters to sue the state if they don't meet their goals? I mean, who does that in a bill? That is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
And of course, you know, we could have predicted this, but now it's being used as justification for
we're going to get sued
for doing stuff, right? Well, they're allowing it.
They could take it out right now. They don't have to. They could. In fact, somebody could have made an amendment on the floor today saying, why don't we just remove the provision about getting sued? But on the other hand, I've seen there's one very litigious solar developer. He's sued the PUC and the governor in federal court. He's sued the Agency of Natural Resources. He's filed so many suits, it's crazy. The AG defends it. You know, so what? You get sued. All right. You look at what the results are and you deal with it.
Right.
And you know, the state of Massachusetts is ahead of us, and CLF sued. And what was the result of that? My understanding is that as a result, the state decided to do a big electric line from Canada called Northern Pass. How'd that go?
Really, exactly. So, Annette, we've got 3 minutes left, and I would like to just make sure that you've given to us all the information you think our viewers need to understand this issue and to know to call and to hopefully say, do something else, people.
So I think that we've covered pretty much all the points that I think are important for people to hear. I do think that at this stage with the bill, tomorrow will be third reading and then it'll be voted out and sent over to the House. The legislature takes a week off. It will probably then be taken up by the House Environment and Energy Committee, which is a new committee. They are overwhelmed with work. The House actually cut out a committee. They merged House Energy and Technology with Natural Resources, Fish, Wildlife, and Water. So that committee has so much on its plate. It's got some must-pass bills. I feel very bad for the chair and the committee for all that they have. And to have to do this, they're also likely to get this housing bill. I mean,
oh, wow.
So I guess what I want to say is that people need to contact their House members, be kind to that committee, be understanding that they have issues. Now, that committee does have some people with conflicts of interest. There is one person on the committee who works for the Regulatory Assistance Project. There's another person on the committee that works for the Energy Futures Group, which was the co-author of the Clean Heat Standard. And I was very surprised that those people were put on that committee. So it's something that I think that as we have time, if people have taken in any of this information, to try and educate your House representatives, even if they're not on the committee of jurisdiction, to help them understand, try and have a conversation about what is this bill? Do you understand how it works?
Right.
Do you understand what it does and what it costs just to get it back to the legislature? And is this really a good use of public dollars at this time when there are so many needs? I think that's the value and the opportunity that we have this year is to take what we now know about this bill and have those conversations, come over to the State House at lunchtime, and don't attack anybody. There are no villains here. These are our public servants. They're good people. But I think education is necessary the more that we understand what this does.
I agree with you. Thank you so much, Annette, for being with us. I really appreciate it. Ben, you have any final thoughts? We've got about 40 seconds.
I would just add that for me, it's really frustrating that all the time and energy that's gone into this, when we have real environmental problems in our backyard, we're dumping raw sewage into our lakes and streams, and we're spending all this time
and
talking
money
about a policy that doesn't work and actually isn't proven to reduce carbon emissions. There's so many other things we could be doing to do this, and we're not doing those things.
Great show to both of you. Thank you very much for this discussion. It's great. Thank you for listening and tuning in. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites.